when I'm in my life, it's like I am floating down this fast moving river and I can just barely keep my head above water. I'm splashing and I'm trying and I'm just barely getting a breath at a time. And it just feels like I have no control over where this river is going. I can't see what's coming up. I'm just trying to get a breath.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Webdelics podcast, where we're on a journey to find out the truth about psychedelics and plant medicine, to get rid of the myths and to change the narrative. I'm your host, Scott Mason, and with us today is a fascinating guest, Will Barone. Will, tell us all about yourself.
Hey, Scott. It's good to be here with you today. So, in short, I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm based in Oakland, California. I have focused in this world of psychedelic mental health for over a decade now. My time is really split in how I interact with this work between running a ketamine-assisted psychotherapy program that is very much built in a psychedelic therapy model, which we'll have a chance to talk about, and then also in running what's called qualitative research studies. So a big part of my focus has been actually interviewing participants who go through these clinical trials for MDMA and psilocybin, ketamine, to get a better sense of their experience going through these treatments, better understanding how they work, what's working, what's not working, and really wanting to give a voice to people who are experiencing these things. So that's a big part of what I do here.
What you just said goes so much as to the heart of what we're doing here at Webdelics. Human-centric, but also credible and with the appropriate subject matter expertise to stand up as someone that the audience can and should listen to. And the credentials are very impressive, Will. Welcome to the show. The theme of today is about ketamine. What exactly are the different models of ketamine treatment, and what are their effects on mental health? So let's just dive right into it, Will. We don't need to just go in circles around anything. Let's just cut to the chase. What are the different models of ketamine therapy? I assumed there was just one sort of model. You went into it and everyone did sort of the same thing, just in a different clinic. But I think this topic may have just busted my ignorance out for the whole world to know about.
Right, Scott. What you're speaking to is, I think, really, really common, and this is something that I think is the vast majority of people out there are experiencing that they hear ketamine therapy might be good for depression, or they read, it's been in so many publications, New York Times, all over the place, this idea of this new treatment of ketamine, and I think many people have the takeaway that that is just one thing. That if you are calling any ketamine program in the US, that you're going to be going in and getting the model of ketamine treatment that is, people would think is approved or accepted or is the best practice. But what's really interesting about the world of ketamine treatment, and we can talk a little bit about some of the reasons why this is that it's a little bit of uh, I don't want to say the Wild West, but it's a little bit of the, there's a lot of different routes being tried right now. There are a lot of different ways ketamine is being employed. And part of that is that ketamine is such a versatile tool. It can be used in different ways to meet the needs of different people in different ways. So there are some ways that I think that variety is quite useful and beneficial, that there are people who may be appropriate for these different models. Uh, and then we can think about what those different models are and who might fit into those categories. So as a starting point there, the way that I do think about it is kind of on a spectrum, and there are a number of different parameters that would fit a ketamine program into um, one of these systems of treatment. And so that first spectrum is on the end of what is called the medical model on one end. And so this is going to be the most common way that ketamine is employed, or that it has been employed in the US. is a model where ketamine is used specifically as a medication alone. So the idea is that ketamine in itself as a medication has some pharmacological antidepressant effects that work for some portion of the population who take it. And the idea is that if we just get enough ketamine in this person's system, they should start to experience some antidepressant effects
Mm.
from that. And so often, what these programs look like, a common model is what are called ketamine infusion programs. And so these are often set up, they were actually first kind of set up in a model similar to ECT or electroconvulsive therapy treatments,
Wow.
because that was a similar model at the time of having somebody come into a clinic, get treatment multiple times per week. And so they originally were kind of using that system as a model for, okay, how do we employ ketamine? And so they kind of came up with this initial model that was generally 3 times per week. People would come into an office, sit down in a chair, get an IV infusion of ketamine, and that was the entire treatment. Um, very little preparation, if any, very little therapeutic support, if any, really giving all the heavy lifting to this medicine alone.
Hmm.
So that is really one end of the spectrum of the treatment. The other end of the spectrum, which is a little bit where my practice sits, actually quite far on the other end of the spectrum, is the therapeutic or even psychedelic model of using ketamine. And so this is where we're using ketamine as a tool to deepen a process of self exploration, psychotherapeutic process. We're using it rather than just as a pharmaceutical aid. While we do lean on the antidepressant effects that ketamine can have, we're much more using it less frequently, sometimes in higher doses, but not always, but really with the aim of deepening a process of self exploration and growth that can really get to the roots of the issues rather than just covering them up as symptoms.
So, are you suggesting that, at least from your perspective, one end of the spectrum is better than the other? Or are you saying, well, such a choice is probably dependent on the circumstances, the predispositions of the individual that might be seeking it out, or maybe something that they decide working with their doctor or other practitioner, or based on just what they want? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I've come through a bit of an evolution in my thinking around that. I think in my training, and I had amazing training with Korea Institute is and Dr. Raquel Bennett, who's one of the longtime leaders in the ketamine space and does amazing education in the ketamine world and support for the ketamine community. As I was getting my training and learning about this space and coming from the MDMA therapy model that is very therapy focused, and I've come away from my research in the MDMA world really feeling that that it's the psychotherapy that makes change or the self work that people are doing. The medicine is just allowing that to happen. It's supporting that process. So in my process of learning about ketamine, I early on was very much feeling this is the right way to do this.
Mm.
The right way to do this is to use it as a therapy tool. You know, other models are not going to be as useful, they're not going to be as long lasting, they're not going to be as effective. And some of those things may be true. I think in the medical model, the benefits do tend to be more short lived. Um, they don't tend to last as long if you're not getting to the root causes of why these symptoms are happening. But as I've spent time in this field and I've worked with ketamine now for about 5 years and have studied it extensively in that time, I have come to feel more that there are people who may be right for every part of that
Mm.
spectrum. There may be some people who are not in a place of wanting to do deeper exploration or psychotherapy, someone who is severely depressed, who is
Mm.
struggling even to, you know, get out of bed or think about things or take care of themselves in any way, that maybe just going in for an infusion and getting some boost to step out of that may be absolutely appropriate for that person.
We're going to talk about MDMA a little bit later in our conversation, but you raise a really interesting point in this last sentence that you had. I would imagine that for some people, depression or whatever other mental health challenge that you have that could be dealt with via ketamine therapy might have put you in such a critical and emergency state that right you just don't have time to deal with the root stuff, at least in the first instance. I also have to wonder, maybe I'm crazy, but like I know people, there's someone I know who says, I'm not a deep person. I'm just not a deep person. I'm shallow and I own my shallowness. That's who I am. Maybe just sort of thinking about if you're a shallow person and you don't want to go deep because that's just not who you are, but you're still depressed. Hey, I don't want shallow people to be depressed either. Maybe something like this could work for them, or maybe something somewhere else on the
Mhm.
spectrum. What might some other points within that spectrum look like, just to give us a little bit of an
Mhm.
idea of the full range of what's out there?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, because there is quite a bit in between those two ends of the spectrum, that could meet people's needs like that. And so one thing that has come up in the last couple years specifically that I think something we need to think about is that there are pros and cons to every one of these. There are things to weigh out in terms of the potential risks, the potential benefits, the potential costs. So all of those things are in each of these models we're talking about. But something that has come up in the last couple years is the greater abundance of at-home ketamine treatments.
Mm.
And so this is something where there are some large companies that have come out, that are sometimes doing quite minimal assessments, online and sending people ketamine to their door. And uh, there's a lot to be said about that.
Hmm.
I think there are some ways that, um, I end up being quite mixed. I think there are some ways that there are some people out there that absolutely can
Yeah.
meet their needs of being something that's lower cost,
Hmm.
something that's more accessible. Um, Someone who's maybe not interested in doing a ton of depth work, but needs some kind of boost pharmacologically. But I think with that, it also increases risk in a number of ways to be not really deeply assessing people for safety or appropriateness, to be sometimes sending people large amounts of ketamine without much direction, as to how to take this safely or reduce some of the risks that are there for taking ketamine too frequently, too regularly. So all of that does come up in that model potentially as well.
Our audience is made up of a very wide variety of people, many of whom are totally unfamiliar with the psychedelic world, or they may be just familiar enough to understand some basic concepts, but not really understand the difference between how they play out in real life between each other. So, for instance, I will bet you money that there are folks out here, this might be their first, second, third episode, who have heard us discuss shamanistic psychedelic experiences in regards to some of the other substances that are emerging within the psychedelic space as common things that people are exposed to and used. Is there any sort of shamanistic equivalent in the ketamine world?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great question of how to tie this to some of these other conversations that may have been on the Webdelics podcast before this, and other things that people will hear about the psychedelic space. And ketamine is an interesting area because it is this mixing of a medicine that is fully based in the Western medical model.
Mm-hmm.
This is a medicine that has come about in the last 100 years through pharmaceutical development. There's not a natural form of ketamine that's been used culturally or in any other practice. That being said, there is definitely a part of this spectrum, generally over in the therapeutic, or what's often called ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. Sometimes that can be done in more of a traditional Western psychotherapeutic way that feels more like you're in a therapy office with a therapist, clinician, and the work maybe looks a little different from regular therapy because this medicine is involved and it's a longer session and all of these things. Um, some practitioners working in that therapeutic model do absolutely bring in some shamanic elements. And so there is some ways to use ketamine to tap into these maybe more spiritual realms, more shamanic realms, ways of um, using this as a medicine just like any other to access those other parts of the world or spirituality. So that absolutely can potentially make its way in, even though ketamine is not maybe rooted in that history.
So let's say you're my homeboy Juan from the Boogie Down, aka the Bronx, and you've been feeling depressed. You're not someone who prides themselves on being shallow. You're not in an emergency situation. And this is something that you might imagine wanting to explore. Now, let's say you're, like I said, you're my homie, you've been to therapy already, maybe for a number of years. You know what a therapy model looks like. You go make your appointment with your therapist, you go, you sit down on the couch or chair or whatever, you talk for an hour, and then you leave. You might have even gone through some more uh, complex or more intensive therapeutic modalities like EMDR. I was in therapy for 11 years. I've talked about that openly since the first episode of this show. And something that was truly transformative for me was engaging with EMDR therapy for years. It changed my life. So
Mm-hmm.
you might be familiar with something like that, yet ketamine is a step beyond that in terms of what's involved. With it from an actual going to therapy and sitting down right perspective.
Mm-hmm.
You're having an infusion or you're doing whatever it is that you do. Talk to me a little bit about, okay, I have set up my first ketamine therapy appointment. I am taking the subway or riding my car up to the office of the individual that I'm working with. I'm about to turn that doorknob and enter through the doorway. What is going to happen next for me?
Great. Yeah, great question, Scott. So let's talk a little bit about what this looks like in my practice because that's what I can speak to the most, and I think this can give a better illustration of how this model of ketamine-assisted psychotherapy can look for people, and I think in general that's going to be the way that has, um, I think in many cases the highest balance between benefit and risk. And so maybe we can focus there a little bit.
Yeah.
So in ketamine assisted psychotherapy, we're thinking about ketamine as being rooted in a psychotherapeutic relationship, a therapy relationship. And so often, if someone is coming to me, this person gets referred to me, we're going to have a number of contacts before ketamine is actually involved. So we will start with quite an intensive assessment process. We want to make sure this person is safe to do ketamine. This is a good medicine for them. They're appropriate in what they're bringing in, their mental health issues, their physical health issues, that their medical team may be on board or is on board with this treatment. And sometimes we do work with people's providers if they do have questions
Mm-hmm.
about, what kind of ketamine treatment is this person getting? Why
Mm-hmm.
are they getting it? How's that going to work with their other medicine? We do a lot of consulting with people's, active teams about those things. And so very often people are getting referred to us either by their therapists or their doctors or other people they're working with, or they're coming to us directly. And often the reason that people are coming is kind of in this space of, I've been doing this a long time. I've been dealing with mental health issues.
Mm.
I've been in therapy. I've been in all these treatments. And the people that I see often do very, very well in ketamine assisted psychotherapy are people who can say, I've really been trying. I've been trying everything I could.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I even feel like I've gotten some benefit. Maybe I feel like I have made some room, um, but I'm feeling kind of stuck.
Mm.
I'm feeling like I haven't quite gotten where I want to get. and ketamine feels like that next thing.
Mhm.
Like you said, it feels like kind of the next level of adding some bigger guns to this arsenal,
Mhm.
so to speak. So very often people are coming to us, I've tried all the medicines, or I've tried all these other treatments, and sometimes ketamine is thought of as, I think this is my last chance. This is the thing that I need to try to get better. So that's often how someone might be coming to us. So we're wanting to get really a lot of good information about them in an intake process. So they'll meet with me as a psychologist, as well as generally a psychiatrist, a medical provider who can prescribe the ketamine and provide the injections if we are using an injection model. Once we go through that initial assessment, make sure this person is appropriate, then we go into what's called preparation therapy phase. And so often in our practice, that's going to be between 2 and sometimes even 6 therapy sessions. So that's 1 hour online, generally, sessions.
Mm.
And that is really meant to do a couple things. One, I want to take as many of the unknowns out of the equation as I possibly can. So often talking about, what is this office going to look like? What's going to happen on the day of the medicine sessions? What might we be working on? What might the medicine feel like? And then we talk about that there are a lot of unknowns that we actually can't take off the table.
Mm.
So what exactly is going to come up for you when the medicine is active? Exactly what the medicine is going to feel like. Those are things that are going to be inherently unknown in this person's process.
Mhm.
And preparing for those unknowns is part of what can make a successful treatment. I think many times when people are going into ketamine without that good preparation, there's a lot more possibility to be anxious,
Mm.
to have panic reactions, to
Mm.
feel fearful
Mhm.
when this medicine starts coming on. And ketamine can feel very weird. It is a profoundly psychedelic medicine in certain doses. It can be very dissociative in some ways. So when someone is not well prepared for that, this medicine is going to make me feel very different than how I normally feel.
Mhm.
um, we do see this in the research as well. When people are not well prepared, there's a lot higher incidence of these kind of adverse events or challenging experiences.
So, we're going to talk about then what happens when the treatment actually starts and what happens afterwards in a moment. But let's detour a little bit to resolve some outstanding threads that at least I'm hearing in what you just stated.
Mm.
What might cause someone to be physically or from a mental health perspective not right for ketamine treatment, even in the therapeutic context?
Mm. Yes, that's a great question, Scott. So that is kind of a complicated question. It's not as clear to just say, here's X, Y, and Z. These things are always rule outs
Mm-hmm.
for ketamine, and these things are always going to be okay. We have a medicine. So ketamine is generally generally it has a very wide safety profile. In using it the way that we use it in our practice, where we're using it about once a month actually as a medicine, there are generally few risks. There's not no risks. There are things that we need to consider, absolutely, and there are ways that ketamine can have negative effects in overuse
Mm.
in certain people with certain conditions. But generally, it is considered quite safe. And just for the people listening who don't know this, ketamine is actually a very widely used medicine in in the United States and in the world. It's actually one of the necessary medicines that we have. So it's very widely used in anesthesia, for pain management, and it's in those settings is often used in much, much higher doses than we're using in psychiatry, actually. And so even when it's used in those medical settings, doctors really like ketamine because it tends to be very safe, even for children, even for elderly folks with comorbid conditions. And they prefer ketamine because it doesn't depress our respiratory drive. It doesn't slow our breathing or our heart rate the way that some other anesthetics do. So those are some of the things that do make it, more safe to use in an outpatient psychiatry setting.
Wow. That actually is very, very important to know. And I'm so glad you got that out. And it ties back into what was the next question I had. You referenced this briefly earlier, but I am curious as to your thoughts on how this will impact the future of ketamine or whether it will impact it at all. On the one hand, as you've said, ketamine is a highly psychedelic drug. On the other hand, as you also said, it doesn't come from the uh, same sort of tradition as, say, ayahuasca or psilocybin. As you correctly mentioned, it's only existed for the past 100 years or so, and it comes out of the Western medical tradition. So let's say you are Bob and Judy from Wisconsin, and you are only going to feel safe. And you're, by the way, maybe a senior citizen, and you may be concerned about taking medicines that could put you at risk, particularly if, like, let's say you have diabetes or your husband has a pacemaker or something like that. You may be concerned about the impact of comorbidity. Um,
Mm-hmm.
the fact that it emerged through the Western medical tradition may actually provide you with some comfort, because I would think that this has opened the door at least to this substance having been vetted to some extent through processes that other uh, more quote unquote pre-Western medicine substances might have had. But do you find that to be true? Is there anything in what I just said that is inaccurate, misleading, otherwise needs to be clarified?
I think you're absolutely right there. I think because of ketamine's history, and because of that, because it being rooted in that Western medical model, with it having thousands of research studies on its safety and efficacy, and already thousands for its use in mental health conditions, it is also one that people will feel uh, that it feels better to even talk to their
Mm-hmm.
family doctor about. I'm concerned about my heart condition. Do you think ketamine would be okay
Mm-hmm.
for me? Where many of those people would not feel okay saying, I'm thinking about taking MDMA with an underground therapist. Is that going to be okay? So I think you're right that there are many more people that will feel comfortable accessing something like ketamine that they can do in an above board therapy office with a clinician who is licensed by a state board, and if something goes wrong, there's actually a route that they could take care of that, where that isn't always an option in the underground. We also have a lot more data about its safety profile, the potential risks. And so I think if we are doing well as practitioners, we're communicating well to our clients about what those risks
Mm-hmm.
are and helping them understand um, the safety profile before we get started.
Let's talk then a little bit about what would make a therapeutic session or series of therapeutic sessions after these treatment times work, what might not make them work. And then I want to start to move towards your discussion about MDMA, because we've hinted at it a couple of times before. Let's roll up the sleeves and get to it in a few minutes. But what makes something really work from a post treatment or post ketamine experience perspective, and what makes it kind of not be what it needs to be?
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And so what we're talking about, some of these things in even in the ketamine session, of being able to use this altered state experience to explore ourselves, to better understand what's happening in my life, what's not working, what's we in the pattern of life. We can get so stuck. It's hard to see a visual that another client provided that I think is masterful, and I use this often, and I tell him I give him anonymous credit, and he's happy with that. He said it's like when I'm in my life, it's like I am floating down this fast moving river and I can just barely keep my head above water. I'm splashing and I'm trying and I'm just barely getting a breath at a time. and it just feels like I have no control over where this river is going. I can't see what's coming up. I'm just trying to get a breath. And he said he feels like in these ketamine sessions, these with the medicine, with that extended time that is devoted for his own healing, he feels like he gets kind of plucked out of this river and put on the bank.
Mm.
And that gives him a chance to actually take a look at the river from this other perspective and see, oh wait, there's actually a fork coming up
Mm-hmm.
where one end of the river moves much slower, or there's a bank that I can actually get off and rest up ahead, if only I know the layout, if I'm not just in the river trying to get a breath. And so a big part of what the follow-up of this work can be after kind of having that separation, and sometimes having a window after these ketamine sessions of feeling some space. There is a period for many people after a ketamine session of antidepressant effect, of anti-anxiety effect, where people do describe feeling just a bit more spacious. I have a bit more room to take things on or try new things or open myself up in a way that is different from my stuck reactions, my stuck patterns. And so we really want to work with that while it's there to start incorporating patterns that are more like who I want to be. And we find that it opens a window of neuroplasticity. So that's one thing that we do know about ketamine, is there's a window where our brain is actually more active. It's more open to growing, in opposition to when we're depressed, where our brain actually becomes very rigid. It becomes very stuck. It sticks to a pattern that kind of works, quote unquote works. It keeps us moving forward, but not really in a way that's successful. And so ketamine can open up this neuroplastic window where our brain is reaching out and open to new things, and it can develop new patterns, and it can try new things. So in the follow-up sessions, we're really aiming to, what does it look like to integrate this back into daily life? What does it look like to work with this time that we're feeling a little bit more space? How do we continue to work on these things that may have come up? So that's a lot of the work that we're doing.
Thank you, Will. I can hear my sister from another Mr. Kathy from, I don't know, Chicago. Kathy is saying, okay, this man keeps talking about MDMA, and I don't really understand the difference between the two. And what is he talking about when he says some of the things that we've learned from MDMA can be imported into the ketamine experience? So you got to help my girl Kathy out, even though she doesn't really exist. Maybe she does.
Kathy may be out there in some way.
Right now, exactly.
Yeah, and people are definitely asking those questions, and that's been a big part of my work over the last decade, is how do we integrate the lessons from these different medicines to make each one better, right? And especially with ketamine, where it is being used in these different ways, some of them are implementing lessons from these other treatments, and some of them are not. Before I jump to that real quick, just a final note before moving on, what I will say is, all of this stuff that I'm talking about in that ketamine-assisted psychotherapy model, where it's about, using the experience to understand maybe ourselves better, or use that time after the session to make changes that could be long-lasting, or move us closer to who we want to be, that generally those conversations and that type of exploration is not happening in the medical model, or often in the at-home,
of course,
self-treatment
model. Right.
So just to say, oftentimes those things there's this huge potential that comes up when in these ketamine sessions, and it's very likely sometimes people do feel benefit from taking it just as a medicine, but I feel like in some cases it could be leaving a lot on the table, and may not lead to the depth of change that many people are hoping for, if they don't step through that door and do that work that is connected to it. So just wanted to say that, and that is connected to what we've learned from MDMA. So maybe that is a good segue. And so just briefly, to fill in this idea of what is MDMA and how is it different, MDMA and ketamine are different medicines. They're positioned interestingly because they are two medicines that are generally considered not classical psychedelics. So they're not under that same umbrella as
Right.
LSD, ayahuasca,
Right.
um, mescaline,
Right.
for example. But MDMA and ketamine both have what I would call psychedelic properties in terms that they are medicines that change our consciousness, they change our awareness, they are mind manifesting, is what the term psychedelic actually means
Mm-hmm.
in its Latin roots. So they absolutely, I think, give us a connection to a different experience of our mind than we normally have. So that is why I often refer to MDMA and ketamine as psychedelics, even if they are not kind of under that umbrella of classic psychedelics. MDMA and ketamine go about their medicinal action in very different ways pharmacologically. So, ketamine is what's called a dissociative anesthetic medicine, and it works on a number of different pathways in our brain. We have some idea of how it works. We know it's tied to the NMDA receptor system. We know it's tied to GABA. Um, there are a number of different things that it's doing to create this dissociative experience, this altered state. But it's very different from the classic psychedelics that mostly work
Mm.
on serotonin. And so all of those classic psychedelics do uh, impact serotonin in one way or another. And that's what's thought to be
Mm-hmm.
a core component of how they create this altered experience. MDMA is similar in that way that it also very much works on serotonin, but it does it in a bit different way than the classic psychedelics. And so MDMA is a medicine that, um, unlike classic psychedelics, is more of what is often called an empathogen, or an entactogen is another word for that. And that means that while many people do not experience hallucinations or visual experiences on MDMA, it really deeply connects people with their emotional process. It provides a sense of safety and connection. And we know that it does a number of things in the brain that makes it really well suited to aiding in
Mm-hmm.
psychotherapy, specifically for trauma. And so that was actually a lot of my early research was looking at what does MDMA do in the brain, what does trauma do in the brain, and why are they such a good fit in this model of treatment. And what we find is that MDMA is actually doing almost the exact opposite thing in our brain that a trauma experience is doing. And so when we take MDMA, it's really balancing out these trauma reactions that we have, this hypervigilance, the increase in amygdala functioning that is assessing everything as dangerous when it really isn't, most likely. MDMA helps to decrease functioning in our amygdala system. And so what that means is it allows people to sometimes go through these psychotherapy processes, especially in trauma focused therapy, that can be very, very difficult for people to go through. Often, trauma therapy is a very challenging experience because it is bringing up these old wounds that have been packed away and that are hard to access for very good reasons. Our body has packed those away to protect
Yeah.
us. But the problem is when our body stuffs it down and puts that wound deep, deep, deep down, it still kind of festers in there. It's not really healed, it's just scabbed over.
Yeah.
And so we still feel these systemic effects of that trauma over time. And so the idea of using a medicine like MDMA to get at that treatment, it's helping to soften all of those systems that make it possible to go in and open that wound, to clean it out properly,
Mm-hmm.
to do that work around it in a way that doesn't trigger that fight or
Mm-hmm.
flight response, that doesn't make us shut down, that doesn't, push us into territory that's too hard to handle.
Are these sorts of treatments, we'll focus on ketamine because that's the underlying subject of today's episode, potentially not just psychotherapeutic treatments, but the sorts of things that, because the self help movement, the personal development movement, the leadership movement are all rooted to some extent or another in basic psychological understandings and teachings. Are they things that you could see over time and with the right sets of limitations or regulatory infrastructures or whatever else we might need, things that could be expanded more broadly into the personal development realm?
Mm. It's an interesting question. That's not what I have focused directly on. I'm very much my work is focused on how to integrate these things to treat quite severe mental health issues. So that's where I've focused my time, and I think that is a place that I can speak to as where we can manage the safety and the risks, the potential risks that these medicines do have. They're not all safe or all good for
Yeah.
everybody all the time. And so that's where I've focused my work. Um, do I see the potential for them being beneficial for self growth? I absolutely I see that potential. I mean, I can speak to ways in my own lives and people in my community that many people have had benefit from taking psychedelic medicines and MDMA and ketamine in some ways. And I've also seen uh, the downsides of those. When these medicines are not taken with intention, when they're not used just for beneficial purposes, but when they are overused, when they can cause addiction and dependence issues, when they can cause health, physical and mental health issues. So, just something to say, they're not safe all the time. These are things that need to be highly considered. We need to be well educated about these medicines that we're using and what can help to decrease the risk if we are choosing to use them um, for personal growth or outside of a therapy context.
Well, and that was part of the question, really, behind the question that I was asking, because as wonderful and transformative as the self help, self improvement, personal development, leadership, all whatever you call it, the transformational space can be, it's not one that is known for barriers to entry for practitioners,
Mm-hmm.
nor is it known for necessarily the most heavy handed or even any handed at all regulatory oversight. And so we're talking about bringing substances into a space where we don't have a long history of regulatory or ethical protocols or things like that, that do present potential opportunities for harm. And that's where I think a lot of the fear around this goes. Also, I felt it was important to raise this because folks can sometimes, and it's not that they're bad people, I'm guilty of this myself. They can hear what they want to hear. We can hear what we want to hear. I can hear what I want to hear and get excited about this. Oh, if this is great at home, if I'm feeling clinically depressed, well, imagine if I'm in a normal state or even a little bit excited and just want to pump it up a little further, right? That
Mm-hmm.
could bring about real danger. So you really clarified that. If there is one thing that I could take away from this entire conversation, Will Barone, it is that when we say words like ketamine treatment, it can mean a lot of things. So if people start talking about this, or if I start to get curious, or if someone raises it with me right from jump, I need to start asking, what are you talking about specifically? And I need to start thinking, well, what might work best for me? And what are the minimum of standards that I'm going to be accepting when it comes to moving into this sort of treatment space? Will, give us a last word or a single takeaway that you would like to share before we say goodbye for today?
Yeah, Scott, I think your takeaway is right in line with that. That there is, if this is something that people want to explore, that there is some education to be done, because there are so many different ways that these medicines are currently being used and can be used. But really wanting to understand what is going to be the right fit for you, um, all of those different parameters, weighing cost and risk level and potential benefit, all these different things. I would suggest talking to different providers if this is, something that you're looking into. We do a free consultation that in our program is not at all a sales call. I'm talking to people looking for ketamine treatment, and many times I am referring to other
Mm,
programs, or maybe not suggesting ketamine at
mhm.
all. And so I tell people at the top, this is not a sales call. I want to help you find what's right on your path. I know many providers that do that. So have some conversations. I know that's not always easy to do when we're looking for treatments, but I do suggest taking your time with this and finding what might be a good fit. And then also just being aware of, these things are not magic bullets. Being able to manage our expectations that all of these medicines open a window of possibility, but we still have to be the ones to walk through and take advantage of that. They don't solve our problems on their own. They can just be one tool in that system.
What an eloquently put last word. Will, where can people find out more about you? And do you have any projects or anything that's going on that you want to share with us?
People can find me on online on various systems. If you search Will Barone ketamine or Will Barone MDMA, you'll find some of my
Mhm.
research papers. I will be speaking at a number of conferences. Next week, I will be in the Netherlands for the ICPR conference, speaking about a paper that I published last year on MDMA for anxiety associated with terminal illness. So that will be a presentation coming up next week. And you can also find me working with Zendo Project, a psychedelic harm reduction program that works at Burning Man, various other
Mhm.
festivals and events, and works on sometimes working with the difficult side of what can come up with these medicines, or just when people need support.
Glad you're keeping it real. For those of you who are listening to or have watched this episode, keep tuning in because we have even more interesting content coming up. And it is going to be engaging, credible, and human. If you think that the information that you got in the episode today could help someone in your life, please tell them about what we're doing. And then ask them to subscribe to this podcast on their favorite audio platform or on YouTube. And by the way, you do the same. And if you particularly like this episode or any other episode, be sure to leave a comment on YouTube or a 5-star review on your favorite audio platform. Then, once you've done that, hustle over to our social media sites, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and be sure to follow us for more interesting and informative content. Once you've done all of that, go to our website, webdelics.com. That's webdelics.com. And then sign up to our blog and our emails for more credible, vetted, reliable information. And whew, once you've done all that, and you're going to love every second of it, be sure to come back for another episode of the Webdelics podcast.